We already reviewed the RTX 2080 FE. It's on the channel. We did all the jokes. We did the push the button and turn RTX off and on joke thing. Talked about the bad marketing, talked about the missteps by nVidia, and talked about the product positioning of the 2080, when it's viable, when it's not, when does it make sense, when absolutely should you just buy a 1080 Ti instead. We did all that. Check the channel for that one. Today we're talking about, well, it's both today, but we're talking about the 2080 Ti. That's the interesting one here, because the 2080, if you saw our previous video in gaming, it functionally equals a 1080 Ti for performance. So the 2080 Ti by brute force alone should be better and more interesting, and that's what we're going to get into for this one. Before that, this video is brought to you by Be Quiet and the Silent Bass 601. The Silent Bass 601 is one of the quietest cases we've tested recently, laying claim to the crown of silence on our charts, and still manages reasonable airflow by shipping with a pair of high-quality fans. The 601 also uses well-designed panels and unique ease of installation features to streamline builds, includes well-placed dust filtration, and is large enough as a box to fit a full ATX build. Learn more at the link in the description below. So as previously stated in the other video, there will be a link below for the testing info, stuff like that, methodology, additional resources. Absolutely check our 2080 review. There's a lot in there that's applicable even here to the 2080 Ti. So that's important. You should check it out. And it also discusses the marketing in more depth and about how nVidia handled this launch in general, because that's part of the review too. If we're all honest, that affects how people perceive the product in significant ways. So we'll leave that to that previous video. For this one, 2080 Ti is primarily going against the 1080 Ti and against the 2080 for purposes of this comparison. We have thermal data, we have frequency decay versus thermals, so we have thermal frequency charts. We have some RPM, fan RPM versus thermal charts. We've got additional information on just scaling, 4K, 1440, 1080, how does it scale across resolutions? That'll all be in here. Test methodology more below, but we're using 8086K at 5 gigahertz, that's all in the charts. And then if you need game graphics settings, those are in the charts as well. In the headers, additionally, for anything that says overclocked, we use auto fan speeds for them for gaming, but for our overclock stepping chart, we push to 100% for the RPM so that we can figure out what is the temperature versus frequency decay. How much frequency, how many megahertz do you lose as you increase the temperature? So that's part of what we're looking at, but otherwise auto fan for the overclock settings in the game charts, because that is the most reasonable user scenario. And then also one final note, we're using board partner 10 series cards, not the reference models. The reference models would make the new reference models look a lot better in the charts. That's absolutely true. nVidia would probably be pretty happy with that. Realistically, we think that most people are probably using aftermarket cards, board partner cards, and so it's the fairest comparison. But also, the previous reference cooler is garbage and doesn't cool well, and it drops clocks. And this is a significant upgrade over that. So it makes more sense to go with dual axial versus dual axial in that regard. F1 2018 uses the Ego engine and translates to other Codemasters games. We'll start this one with a more unique chart, just like in the 2080 review that was posted separately. Looking at a resolution scaling chart, we can see how the RTX 2080 Ti compares to different resolutions. In the past, some devices, like the Titan V and the Fury X, have illustrated stronger performance on one end of the spectrum or the other, like 4K. We're not seeing anything too special about this one. It's pretty straightforward, really. Perhaps other games will show more interesting scaling characteristics across the resolutions, as we sometimes see depending on ROPs or other items in the pipeline that benefit 4K versus 1080p. At 4K, the RTX 2080 Ti FE manages to chart top, unsurprisingly once again, with a 99 to 101 FPS average. Frame time performance is still all over the place, but that's an artifact of F1 and not the cards, as we see this behavior on all tested devices. This marks the RTX 2080 Ti as 23% faster than the RTX 2080 and the 1080 Ti alike. Overclocking also gains the 2080 Ti an additional 15% performance, which is actually surprisingly good. Not being power limited would be even better, but nVidia did restrict overclocking pretty heavily with this series of cards. At 1440p, the RTX 2080 Ti's 160 FPS average landed as 20% ahead of the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti, which are roughly equivalent to one another. That's a gigantic price jump for a performance gain, which is, relative to the price, pretty small. Overclocking does help, but then again, so does overclocking the 1080 Ti and RTX 2080. It's not like this is a vacuum for the 2080 Ti. 1080p still shows scaling, as this game is primarily GPU bound with these settings, The GPUs scale all the way up to 211 FPS average on the overclocked 2080 Ti, posting scaling from the 2080 Ti FE's 196 FPS average of 7.7%. That's about the ceiling for this game. Far Cry 5 and the Dunya engine are up next. At 4K, the RTX 2080 Ti FE manages to chart top, again, not surprising, at 74 FPS average. This places it ahead of the stock RTX 2080 FE's 59 FPS average by about 27%, which is one of the most noteworthy gains we've seen of the two cards thus far. The card outperforms the stock GTX 1080 Ti SC2's 57 FPS average by about 29%, which is good for generational gains from Ti to Ti. Unfortunately, this 30% improvement also bears with it a price increase of about 70%, moving from around $700 or so for a decent partner 1080 Ti to $1,200 for similar quality RTX 2080 Ti's, or even the Founders Edition, which is definitely not worth purchasing at that price. The partner models would make more sense at this price, but that's still only assuming that you already want to buy a 2080 Ti. We'll talk about the greater value proposition at the end of this video. Overclocking the 2080 Ti gets it to an impressive 83 FPS average for a gain of 12% over the stock 2080 Ti FE. This is one of the better overclocks we've seen on the FE cards thus far. The 2080 and 1080 Ti remain equivalent, but the 2080 Ti does post actual generational gains. It's just very expensive to get them. Here's a frame time comparison at 4K, showing the RTX 2080, 2080 Ti, and GTX 1080 Ti. Remember, frame times are all about frame-to-frame intervals and pacing, so more consistent delivery is better. A lower number is also better, as 16 milliseconds represents 60 FPS. The RTX 2080 Ti posts both measurable and observational improvement in frame time consistency and overall frame rate, although much of this is through brute force, and the value proposition doesn't quite line up with the gains. At 1440p, Far Cry 5 positions the RTX 2080 Ti at around 127 FPS average, with lows reasonably timed to 88 FPS 1% and 80 FPS 0.1%. The RTX 2080 lands at 105 FPS average, allowing the 2080 Ti a gain of about 21% intragenerational, versus the 1080 Ti SC2, we see a generational gain of 22%. This makes sense as the 2080 and 1080 Ti are functionally equivalent in performance. Overclocking the 2080 Ti puts it at 138 FPS average, a reasonable gain over stock by about 9%. We could get more with an unlocked power limit as found on partner cards, but those are still pretty locked down, just better than this one. 1080p proves to be an invalid test as it becomes CPU bound and demonstrates the 2080 Ti, 2080, and 1080 Ti all within a couple of frames of one another's. But we're going to show the chart anyway just to show what a CPU bound scenario looks like. Sniper Elite 4 is up next and uses the Asura engine. This title, as stated in our RTX 2080 FE review, is one of the most important for a well-optimized, low-level API implementation in a game. This game has shown scaling for asynchronous compute in Volta previously, and we now turn to it for a Turing analysis. At 4K, Sniper Elite 4 posts the RTX 2080 Ti FE stock card at 108 FPS average, with lows exceptionally tightly timed. Though this isn't a behavior of the card, more so of the game. The RTX 2080 Ti ends up 25% ahead of the GTX 1080 Ti SC2, the stock card, which operates an average FPS of 87. That's not as much as Volta led us to believe, sadly, but it's a start. Scaling versus the RTX 2080 is functionally the same, as the RTX 2080 basically equals the 1080 Ti in performance. Overclocking gets the 1080 Ti and the RTX 2080 both to around 90 FPS plus or minus 1, which closes the lead of the RTX 2080 Ti FE stock card down to 19%. Overclocking the 2080 Ti FE widens it once again, scaling to 123 FPS average for a gain of 13% over the stock 2080 Ti FE. Not bad, but still somewhat limited. Shadow of the Tomb Raider runs on a modified Crystal engine and is still a brand new title. Unfortunately, despite being an RTX title, it doesn't have any RTX implementations at this time. At 4K, the RTX 2080 Ti FE performs at 67 FPS average, leaping the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti by about 24% each. These hold at about 54 FPS average. Overclocking boosts us up to 79 FPS average on the Ti FE, which is an impressive 17% gain over stock and distances the card further from its counterparts. At 1440p, scaling wanes from a 24% lead over the 2080 at 4K down to a 20% lead at 1440. The distance grows as resolution increases, which is indicative of a ROPS advantage on the 2080 Ti. The 1080 Ti is, again, roughly equivalent with the 2080, so we'll skip past these comparisons. Let's see if our proof of concept is correct. At 1080p, the RTX 2080 Ti is now 18.7% ahead of the RTX 2080 and GTX 1080 Ti, measuring at 159 FPS average versus about 134 FPS average. This further solidifies that the new Turing architecture scales better at higher sampling rates and resolutions, which also means that it'll do better in handling anti-aliasing at higher levels than its Pascal counterparts. The idea is the same. You're sampling the pixels a lot of extra times, which is functionally a resolution increase. GTA 5 runs on the Rage engine, and although it's from 2015, it remains one of the most popular games on Steam. At 4K, the RTX 2080 Ti FE holds 77 FPS average, a generational gain of 21% over the 1080 Ti SC2, and its 64 FPS average. The 1080 Ti outperformed the RTX 2080 in this game, so the 2080 Ti manages 27% over the 2080, and overclocking is still helpful, but the overclocked 2080 Ti leads the overclocked 1080 Ti by about 27%. 1440p posts waning results, even though bottlenecking isn't really here yet. That's not until 170 FPS or higher. The 2080 Ti's lead over the 1080 Ti diminishes to 15%, making a mockery of the disproportionate generational price gap. Our overclock stepping chart is next. Completely stock, we measured a peak frequency of 1890 MHz with no changes applied. Average frequency dwindled down to 1750 MHz, which is a result primarily of power limitations. As usual, the voltage slider does nothing at all and has no impact on overclocking performance or maximum clocks, although we did end up sliding it all the way to the right at this point just in case. It's not until memory overclocking that voltage ticked up to 1.0 volts, which is lower than Pascal generation's 1.063 volts to 1.093 volt operating range. That said, we don't know that there's really full confidence in these tools just yet. So the voltage, we're not sure how accurate that measurement is from the software, but it would make sense that it would be lower than Pascal. So that does at least somewhat line up with what we'd expect. Anyway, boosting the power to 123%, that's the second step in our process, or the second row. This allowed us to hold an additional 50 megahertz on the clock to 1800 megahertz, average that is, even in spite of higher temperatures. We eventually found a 2100 megahertz peak, similar to the 2115 megahertz peak we hit on the RTX 2080, but immediately power throttled and hit a power perf cap. Our average was closer to 2000 megahertz, where the GPU remained when kept in the 60s Celsius, closer to 70 really. The GDDR6 memory was stable at 850 megahertz offset, but not beyond that. Note again that this is in TimeSpy Extreme, and that this overclock doesn't necessarily hold stable in every single application that exists. It's per application generally that these will work. This one, however, did work in all of our games, so these offsets applied in all game tests. This is also with 100% fan speeds to keep a lower temperature, which were not used in the gaming tests. We stick to auto fan speeds for gaming tests with overclocks for realism. But either way, the 100% speeds at about 60 dBA, 59.4 dBA of noise, do boost the clocks noticeably. Look more closely at the yellow cells next, though. For these, we observed frequency thermal responses at around 79 degrees, where the clock dropped by 50 megahertz. And again, at around 62 degrees, although this is reflected in our previous RTX 2080 non-TI overclock stepping chart from the other video, the RTX 2080 review. Check that for more frequency thermal data. For more frequency and thermal scaling, we look to a 3D Mark looping pass that put the card under 30 minutes of strain. This is with a completely stock GPU with no overclock applied at all. Under these conditions, we see the clocks immediately drop from just over 2000 megahertz down to around 1900 megahertz within the first 90 seconds. The clock eventually settles at 1800 megahertz, a significant downgrade from the initial operating frequency, with the GPU core temperature of 75 degrees Celsius. This is indicative of a limitation in the cooling and power management, one of which is intentional. The cooler can maintain higher clocks, but it'd have to increase the fan speed further. That's what we illustrated in the previous chart. NVIDIA's fan profile is set to favor lower noise levels, which means that we do sacrifice clocks in the process. Board partners should pick up the ball here because they are able to cool better with a larger cooler. Fan speed also ticks up with all this, as shown in our next chart. GPU temperature sits around 75 degrees Celsius with occasional spikes, while the fan RPM ramps from 1500 RPM, about 35 dBA, to 2000 RPM, or about 42 dBA. nVidia doesn't appear to be using its own asynchronous fan technology at all here, even though the fans are capable of spinning independently. It's like they completely skipped on using the feature, despite end-user support. You could asynchronously tune these. To be fair though, in the past, we've found that they do generally work a bit better if they're synchronous, but we haven't tested that with this card. Let's bring in 2 more lines onto this chart, make it a bit complicated. These are for GDDR6 and VRM MOS temperatures, or MOSFET temperatures, measured at hotspots on the card via thermocouples that we attached. On average, the VRM MOS stays below 70 degrees Celsius when the card is under stock conditions, and that's not delta T for our regulars, that's just straight temperature because we're not comparing it to anything else, and the VRAM is around 74 degrees Celsius. These are both well within spec, and it would appear that the cooler does fine for the VRM and VRAM when under stock loads. Despite being an overall inefficient, overly complex, and overly expensive design, the FE card does have the capability to cool the VRM and VRAM, so job well done there. If you're wondering how overclocking impacts thermals, here's a look at our torture run from the thermal bench. The RTX 2080 Ti stock card, before the massive teardown that we filmed, again, before that, operated at about 73 to 75 degrees Celsius during this 30-minute power virus torture load. Running overclocked with the settings we used for our gaming benchmarks and with the fan left to regulate itself under auto settings, GPU core temperature climbed to 77 degrees and fan RPM, not shown here, climbed from 2000 RPM to 2100. Not bad and decent on the silence focus. As for VRM thermals under this scenario, the overclocked card pushes VRM temperatures upwards of 90 degrees Celsius for the hottest MOSFET we could find, and that's with a K-type thermocouple, while stock temperatures are closer to 72 degrees. Technically, that's within spec. Most MOSFETs don't trip OTP until around 150 degrees, and they don't derate hard until around 125 degrees. Still, it's a bigger climb than is necessary in temperature, considering that better cooler designs exist for VRM cooling. And at this hefty premium of $200 extra, you'd expect good VRM cooling on the Founders Edition card. GDDR6 operates within spec under both scenarios, measuring 80 degrees when stock and about the same when overclocked. The 2080 Ti then is far more interesting than the 2080. It's not the most exciting, but there's real performance uplift over things you can't buy. You get a Titan V for more money, sure, but versus the 1080 Ti, there is actual tangible increase in performance. There's a visible and observational increase and measurable increase in frame time or frame to frame intervals. And those are good things. But then if we look at the numbers, again, just like with the 2080, you're looking at something like 15% in the worst cases, but generally 22 to 30% gains from a 1080 Ti to a 2080 Ti if we're looking at a board partner card versus the Founders Edition card. And that will change. We're going to be testing these cards from EVGA or testing one from Asus. So that number will increase, but only so much. And it's still going to be roughly 30 to 35% with board partners for the most part. Can't predict the future, but that's about what it's going to land at. So 30, 35% in those best case scenarios over a 1080 Ti, and the price increase is massive because a lot of these cards are going to be $1,100, $1,200 in the US, and then MSRP is officially $1,000, which is not a terrible increase in terms of the performance increase, but no one wants to see that. And realistically, the cards, even though MSRP is lower than Founders Edition, it's been a while since we've seen cards follow that model and actually drop below Founders Edition and hit MSRP. So I don't know. I don't know how many cards will hit that and if they'll even have the factory overclocked chips, because they might not. NVIDIA's reportedly, according to Tech Power Up, selling chips that are locked from factory overclocking. You can overclock, but not the factory, and that will impact performance too, and probably be in the lower end cards, closer to MSRP. So let's just assume $1,100, $1,200 for a card versus a 1080 Ti. That is an extremely hard sell unless you have a specific need. Like if you absolutely can't get what you need with a 1080 Ti and an extra 20, 30% will get it, then I guess you have one option. Otherwise, developers can get use out of the 20 series cards. We talked about that already. People using Blender as it updates might get use out of it. Unreal Engine, when it updates to 4.21, 4.20, somewhere around there, will eventually get its RTX SDK implementation finalized, and you can start really working on things there. So there's room for people to buy the cards, but generally speaking, unless you really need it and you know you need it because you can't get what you need from a 1080 Ti, then a 1080 Ti value-wise is better But at least with the 2080 Ti, you're getting something. At least there's a tangible gain for the money you're spending. Whereas with the 2080 versus the 1080 Ti, it's basically the same product in terms of gaming performance. You're just gaining features that have no present use for gamers. So we'll revisit this more with the partner models, but that's it for this one. Subscribe for more as always. Patreon.com/GamersNexus helps out directly. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a mod mat like this one, or when they're back in stock, one of our beer glasses, something like the shirt that I'm wearing, but not literally this one. And thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.